Hey guys, Zane here with another one-take review, and today I wanted to talk about Is This Real by Wipers. Is This Real is the 1980 debut album from punk band Wipers, who, along with bands like the Pixies and REM, are considered by many critics and fans alike to be sort of prophets or foreshadowers of punk and grunge music in the 1990s. After listening to Is This Real a number of times, I can certainly see why this is considered such an important album and so ahead of its time. It should be stated that Is This Real is technically composed of two different parts, a side plus or addition, whichever you would prefer, as well as side minus or subtraction. And while it does seem kind of pointless at first to just label the two different sides of the album two different names, kind of just a vanity thing more than everything, it's not so, as the two albums, or the two sides of the album, I suppose I should say, have very different tones to them, yet still they flow together very well. Side Addition is built upon the punky, upbeat musical stylings of Wipers' influences like the Ramones or the Buzzcocks, which kind of makes sense as Wipers do feel like the evolution of those sort of bands. Many of the songs on this side are also very, very short as well, some of them not even breaking 2 minutes, but that doesn't stop them from achieving greatness, and I would even go as far as to say that the song Mystery is one of the best rock songs of the early 80s, and that's not even 2 minutes long. It certainly does help that, like a lot of Wipers' influences that I mentioned before, that early pop-punk kind of sound from the Buzzcocks and Ramones, there are many hooks and melodies on Side Addition that swirl around in your brain and make it a memorable half of the record. Side Subtraction, however, is significantly darker and more gloomy, and that's not to say there aren't any punk songs on there. There's definitely a number of punk-based tracks. The whole album is a punk album to be certain, but there is a sense of chaos rooted within Side Subtraction that isn't quite found on Side Addition. The side opening track D7 is filled with a tone of paranoia and anxiety, which carries over to the rest of the runtime for the B-side of Is This Real, which feels less like the inspiration of evolution of bands like the Buzzcocks and more like the proto-version of a band like Mudhoney or Soundgarden or Alice in Chains. The entire grunge movement can certainly be traced back at least partially to the Subtraction side of this record. While you might think that this major difference in tone from side A to side B would actually be a negative aspect about the record, the two managed to flow together surprisingly well. I mean, obviously they are totally different sounds for the most part, but nonetheless, Wipers still managed to stick to their guns, stick to their sort of early punk influences, while remaining an incredibly unique band that definitely inspired a lot of people along the way. Onto the band themselves, frontman Greg Sage is incredibly interesting and an individual I would argue to be one of the most intriguing figures of early punk. Greg's presence feels very, very stiff, and I do think that in general it almost sounds like he has stage fright almost in the recording studio, but at the same time it comes across as not only natural but lovably awkward as well. His guitar work is pretty strong considering what the record is, his vocals are pathetic. That may be the only time I use the word pathetic in a positive connotation rather than a negative one. And he's obviously filled with angst to some extent, which is something he shows on tracks like Return of the Rat, which ultimately helps define his style as a frontman. Somehow, even through all of his strangeness and quirkiness, or rather because of his strangeness and quirkiness, Greg Sage manages to stand alongside the likes of The Dictators as Handsome Dick Manitoba as one of the most unique frontman and vocalists that have ever come out of punk. And considering the long and very, very strange history of punk as a style of music, that's definitely saying something, because there's been some oddballs out there. Bassist Dave Koopel's bouncy yet still very heavy style of bass playing definitely contributes to the record's overall energy as well, and he does become, just as Wipers are one of the unsung heroes of the early 80s in terms of rock music, one of the most unsung heroes of bass in punk music. However, drummer Sam Henry is probably the most subtly talented member of the entire band. While he isn't necessarily the most standout performer even after multiple listens, he definitely feels essential to a number of tracks here. In fact, he feels essential to the entire album, as his slight surf punk, surf rock influence as a drummer that can even be dated back to acts like the Surfaris definitely gives Is This Real a unique feel to it. While Henry definitely isn't as prominent of a performer as his bandmates, I still can't shake this lingering feeling that Is This Real would maybe be half as good without his slightly surf rock influenced rhythms. So overall, Is This Real feels like a prophetic album in retrospect, and it's been rightfully seen as so in the decades since its release. Influence ranging from bands that would go on to hit Descendants, Weezer, there are just so many that I can name, from the worlds of skate punk and hardcore punk to the realms of power pop and alternative rock. Is This Real really did influence a number of artists, just as Wiper's following album Youth of America would. Similar to other records like the Pixies' Surfer Rosa, Is This Real just feels very ahead of its time, if I'm being totally honest. It does feel like something that would definitely feel more in place in the realm of very late 80s, very early 90s rock and pop punk music, but nonetheless, Is This Real, besides being very influential, obviously, is also just an incredibly fun, bouncy, but nonetheless musically powerful record, especially on the B-side where things get significantly heavier in a way that could only end up influencing the grunge movement of all things. As such, I'm going to give Is This Real 4.5 stars out of 5. It's just an incredible punk record overall, and I think it's essential to listen to if you want to get into punk music, and it's a shame that Wipers never got more credit than they did, as, again, even in the current day, they still are a cult-following band at best, but still, my point still stands. They are super influential and super interesting as well. So again, 4.5 stars out of 5, and with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.